Street Fighter 2. Of all of the game series I could have chosen to cover for Remade, Repackaged, Rebooted, I had to pick Street Fighter 2 and announce it, didn't I? You know what? Let's just roll. Go to the thing. The sooner we start, the sooner we're finished, alright? Let's do it. There are 3 things which have made this video difficult to create. 1, I suck at Street Fighter. Like, really badly. 2, getting MAME to run is an absolute pig, so I had to try and match up arcade versions and console ports with differing names as closely as possible. 3, Street Fighter 2 is infamous for having a billion different versions. In fact, I even made myself a little timeline of the most important entries into the series so that I wouldn't get too confused. As you can see, that timeline starts with Street Fighter 2: The World Warrior. This title was released in arcades in March 1991, and the footage you're seeing here is from the Super Nintendo port released in June 1992. This is the most basic and straightforward version of Street Fighter out there. 8 playable characters, 4 boss characters that are unselectable, and an arcade mode that requires you to fight everyone except yourself, meaning you'll have to win 11 fights to reach the end. The main thing that struck me when I went back to play this game was just how slow it was. I definitely had a better memory of the later games in the series, which are much faster, so the pacing here genuinely surprised me. As I couldn't get the arcade version running, I can't say whether this is just the port, or whether the original machines ran like this too. It definitely changes the way I played. It was more methodical. There was a tension as I waited for openings, and it was far easier to read my opponent's movements. It's amazing to see the amount of difference speed alone can make. This was then followed up by Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition. Now this is where things get a little confusing for home ports, and the footage you're watching right now. The second Super Nintendo title was Street Fighter 2 Turbo, based on the 3rd arcade release called Hyper Fighting. However, it includes a mode titled Normal, which is based on Champion Edition. Meanwhile, the first Mega Drive port arrived, titled Special Champion Edition. This has a game mode called Champ, which is based on Champion Edition, and a game mode called Hyper, which is based on Hyper Fighting, but allowing you to crank the speed up to ridiculous Dragon Ball Z levels. When the arcade version arrived in April 1992, Champion Edition added the 4 previously unselectable boss characters to the roster, and allowed people to use the same character against each other in 2-player matches. This also meant it was now possible to end up fighting yourself in arcade mode, and the number of fights you had to win increased from 11 to 12 accordingly. Some of the in-game art was redrawn, and nearly every background was also recolored. The downside to making Bison, Vega, Balrog, and Sagat, yes, we're using the English names, not the Japanese ones, playable, is that it took away some of the traits that made them special in the first place. In Street Fighter 2, you're only shown 7 matches on the world map. At the end of Fight 7, Balrog, Vega, and Sagat's faces then appear. Beating those 3 then reveal Bison. This would have thrown a new player for a loop way back then. The just when you think you've beaten the game trope. Not only that, but in World Warrior, Balrog's incredibly strong, Vega's incredibly fast, and Sagat's long range and high damage were really apparent. The second they became playable, they all seemed to get weaker, which makes sense as they have to be balanced for 2-player competitive matches. It just takes the edge off them in arcade mode is all. They're not as threatening or imposing anymore as a direct result. Moving on, we have Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting. Known as Street Fighter 2 Turbo in Japan and carrying that same title on home ports, though not to be confused with Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, Hyper Fighting hit the arcades only 8 months after Champion Edition. It was essentially released due to the high number of pirated, modified, or just straight up bootleg versions of Champion Edition floating around. There are two major changes in this edition, the first being that every character got recolored. The second and more important change is that hyper fighting increased the game's speed. This placed a greater emphasis on reaction time and reflexes compared to previous versions of the game. This is much closer to the Street Fighter II I remember. It's chaotic, frantic, and brilliant, but much harder to capture footage for as the matches naturally end much faster too. Nearly a whole year later, in October 1993, Super Street Fighter II The New Challengers burst onto the scene. Ported to the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo in 1994 with the simple title of Super Street Fighter II, this version of the game threw some major changes into the mix. Tons of the in-game sprites were redrawn, your standard background recoloring appeared, the entirety of the audio was redone, additional frames were added to character animations, you could select characters in their World Warrior, Champion Edition, or Hyper Fighting colours, and you even got 5 brand new colour schemes to choose from. Of course, the biggest addition came in the form of 4 brand new playable characters, presenting T-Hawk, a native Mexican warrior, not the skateboarder, Fei Long, a Bruce Lee-inspired martial artist from Hong Kong, DJ, a Jamaican fighter who always gives me trouble when I go up against him in arcade for some reason, and my favourite, Cammy, the British Special Forces operative, or possibly one of Bison's brainwashed minions. I'm not really sure. Street Fighter's canon is almost as confusing as its goddamn release history. I adore Fei Long and Cammy. Both are quick, responsive, and athletic. Usually I'll play as either Ken, Vega, or one of these two. T-Hawk and DJ I honestly don't care for. Despite there now being 16 characters, which was a huge roster for the time, you still only face 12 opponents in arcade mode. This means there are 4 people you won't fight. This brings an element of luck into play, because, let's face it, we all do better against some opponents than others depending on our playstyle, and also makes the map look untidy. In the games, as you beat each character, their location on the map is crossed out. Not fighting 4 people means there are still 4 flags flying when I reach Bison, and it just looks incomplete. Minor gripe, but it bugs me more than it reasonably should. This game runs at a great speed. It felt a little slower than Hyper Fighting, but was significantly faster than World Warrior, striking a great balance between the brilliant lunacy of Hyper and the measured tension of World Warrior. However, in my research, none of my sources mentioned this, so it could just be the result of me playing the SNES console port. Almost there! Now we turn our gaze to Super Street Fighter II Turbo, known in Japan as Super Street Fighter II X Grandmaster Challenge, because hey, we weren't already confused enough. This is the only game which I could actually get named to run, and even that took a lot of faffing about, so we're finally basing everything on the arcade version. It's just as well too, because for home ports, I'd have to look for the 1994 3DO port, the PlayStation and Sega Saturn Street Fighter Collection from 1997, 2000 Street Fighter II X for Matchmaking Service, a Japan-only mail-order title for the Dreamcast, or 2006's Capcom Classics Collection Volume 2 on the PS2 and Xbox. Wow, that is a lot of console ports. Believe it or not, this is the first game in the series to feature super combos and the super meter that goes hand in hand with it. The premise is simple enough. As you perform attacks, you slowly fill the super meter. Once it's full, you can unleash a deadly super combo, which will cause massive damage to your opponent if it hits. Unfortunately, I can't show you any footage of this because I've never been able to pull them off, and the CPU, like a gentleman, decided not to use them either. Juggling, which is basically continuing a combo against an enemy that's in mid-air or falling, makes its debut here, as does the ability to escape a throw. Essentially, if an opponent throws you, you can recover in mid-air and land safely, avoiding the damage you'd usually take when you hit the ground. The speed has also increased, at least in direct comparison to the Super Nintendo port of the New Challengers, and as much as I do really like it, the pace of New Challengers strikes a better balance between strategy and reflex. There's also a brand new character in the form of Akuma. This guy is now a huge part of the Street Fighter lore, and it baffles me that he was introduced this late in. Even then, he was a secret character, so few would have initially seen him. You had to reach Bison with at least 3 perfects and 0 losses. Now, as far as secret boss requirements go in fighting games, that isn't asking a whole lot. Still doesn't mean I was capable of doing it. I even tried downloading a save state set just before the fight, but MAME gave me various error codes when I tried to load it. Seriously, screw MAME. It's an unintuitive piece of software that, for some reason, demands every iteration and board variant of a game, including bootlegs, to be saved to its ROM folder before it'll even run the thing, and its user interface, or rather lack thereof, is inexcusable in this day and age. Still, I imagine most people would have been stoked to see and battle Akuma back in the day, and he remains an awesome addition to the series. In 2001, there was another entry into the series that I've not included on my timeline, Super Street Fighter II Turbo Revival. This game is simply awful. All of the sprites have been redrawn to fit the GBA's lower resolution screen, and the user interface now resembles that of other Capcom fighters from the early 2000s. The fighting mechanics have been dismantled into a far more basic and shallow version of their former selves to account for going from 6 buttons in the arcade to 2 face buttons and 2 shoulder buttons on the GBA. Many of the stages have been altered too. Some changes are minor, such as Zangief's stage no longer having a fence in the foreground. Others are major, such as fighting Guile on a bridge while a jet fighter hovers about in the background. Oh, and you only now face 10 opponents in arcade, not 12. So yeah, excluded from the timeline simply for being absolute crap. Don't waste your time or money on it, not even out of morbid curiosity. 2 years later, in December 2003, Hyper Street Fighter II The Anniversary Edition launched to celebrate the franchise's 15th anniversary. The arcade version never reached British shores, but we did get a PS2 and Xbox release. Now, this game is always in stock for a very low price at pretty much every used game store within a 15-mile radius of me. Except for in the last 3 months when I've actually needed to buy the damn thing for this video. From what I do know about it, Hyper Street Fighter II, not to be confused with Street Fighter II Hyper Fighting, is based on Super Turbo, but allows you to use any version of the characters from any of the previous games. For example, you could play as Ken as he was in World Warrior, Champion, Hyper Fighting, Super New Challengers, or Super Turbo. You can't pick a version of a character from a game they weren't playable in, so Cammy only has 2 versions of herself, and the 4 boss characters don't have a World Warrior variant. Did you get all that? Good? Let's move on. Finally, we reached the game I'm really eager to talk about today, Super Street Fighter II Turbo HD Remix. This is a complete remake of Super Street Fighter II Turbo, and it's done so well. Capcom approached the artists at Udon, the guys behind the awesome Street Fighter comics, which I promised to talk about in my video game comics show at some point in the future, and asked them to give every character brand new hand-drawn animations. They then approached the very talented folks at OC Remix and gave them the task of remixing the classic soundtrack. That's what you've been listening to in the background of this video so far, by the way. The result is a game with an absolutely gorgeous presentation and aesthetic. Seriously, this thing is stunning to look at and listen to. The game was put together by Backbone Entertainment, whose logo you might have seen when booting up PSN and XBLA ports of Sega classics like Sonic the Hedgehog, Golden Axe, or Streets of Rage. It's been rebalanced once again, and you have a choice between characters based on their Super Turbo stats, or slightly stronger versions of the same character, but with no super meter and no ability to perform super combos. Now, given that I can't pull those off in the first place, those versions of the characters tend to suit me quite well. Of course, Akuma remains the secret boss, but now you just have to reach Bison without using a continue and in under 20 minutes. That actually sounds a lot easier than the previous requirements to me. I still couldn't do it. You can also play as him in single player by hovering over Guile and pressing up on the character's select screen. In multiplayer, you do the same thing, but while hovering over E Honda instead of Guile. Now, I am aware that this is apparently an option in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, however, the method of doing so is a lot more convoluted. For me, the speed and gameplay are damn near perfect here. I could be wrong, but it feels like the attacks do slightly less damage in this version of the game to keep the speed, but not have the problem of matches ending in 10 seconds flat. I haven't scientifically tested this, but it's the feeling I get after playing all of these versions of the same damn game back to back. Of course, the modern world demands that the game have an online multiplayer mode, but I think the lobbies have been empty for quite some time now. Don't expect to find a match, and if you do, it's going to be a Street Fighter fanatic and expert who will kick your ass. Or me, while trying to record the footage for this video. You know, you might have got unlucky. One thing that does worry me about this version of the game is that there's no physical release, so we'll likely see a day when you just can't get hold of it anymore. If you do want to grab it, it's on PSN right now for $11.99 and XBLA for $9.99. There isn't a PC version as far as I can tell. For me, the definitive version of Street Fighter 2 and my personal favourite is Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. However, HD Remix comes damn close, and it's entirely my personal preferences. You see, given the option between sprites and hand-drawn animations, I choose sprites for some insane illogical reason. With regards to console ports, and this will sound weird coming from a Sega fanboy, I preferred the Super Nintendo versions over the Mega Drive entries. Reason being that the Super Nintendo's standard controller has 4 face buttons and 2 shoulder buttons, enough to easily cover the arcade's 6-button layout, while a standard Mega Drive pad only has 3 face buttons, half the number of the arcade. There are Mega Drive controllers out there which have 6 face buttons, but I've never found one within the UK. In fact, I only have one myself because David Savage kindly gifted me one during my time in America several years ago. Before we go, there is one more amusing port of Street Fighter 2 that I want to cover. The Game Boy version. From 6 buttons at the arcade to only 2 buttons on the Game Boy, not to mention the complete lack of colour, limited memory, and extremely low resolution of the machine. This port sucks. It makes me appreciate what we put up with as kids and what's available to us now as adults. Still, it's got this cute, quirky charm in its chibi-style characters, and I had a lot more trouble putting it down than I should have. If you're curious, it's worth checking out. I really hope that you enjoyed this video, because I damn near drove myself insane creating it. Maybe next time I'll pick something a little easier, something that I'm actually good at, like, I don't know, Pokemon or something. Anyway, see you next time.